Good evening, and thank you for joining the Prince George's County Historical Society for its February 24th, 2025 History Chat with Troy Mosley as he chats with Damon Austin about his book, The Armed Forces and American Social Change, An Unwritten Truce. I'm Donna Schneider, President of the Historical Society. We would like to thank our members for joining this evening. The Society does not receive any funding other than from membership, sponsorships, and donations. So if you'd like today's program, please consider becoming a member or making a donation to help us keep these history chats free for all. We kindly ask you to mute your microphones as we do record these chats. You can find the chat on our YouTube channel, which is on the Society's website, www.pghistory.org. There will be a Q&A after the chat, so please put any questions you have in the chat box, and we will get to as many questions as we can. Mr. Mosley's book, The Armed Forces and American Social Change, is a powerful depiction of Black American struggle for equality told through the lens of uniformed military service. Troy Mosley uses superb storytelling, personal vignettes, and historical examples to show how millions of Americans have lifted themselves from oppression through opportunities gleaned from military service. Collectively, these efforts exerted positive outward pressure on American society, which by and large has registered social change. Troy Mosley is a retired Army lieutenant colonel, a 20-year veteran and civil servant. He grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and is a graduate of Florida A&M University with a BS degree in psychology and earned his commission through Florida A&M's ROTC program. Troy has held various military assignments in his 20-year career, including medical platoon leader for the 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment of the 7th Infantry Division in Fort Ord, California. Troy taught medical support and evacuation at the U.S. Infantry Center and School in Fort Benning, Georgia, before being selected to attend Baylor University's Master of Health Administration program through the Army's Advanced Civil Schooling program. He completed his administrative residency at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center and was there when the hospital received sailors wounded in the USS Cole bombing attack in Yemen. Troy also served under the first Black commander of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Major General Elder Granger. Major General Granger charged Troy with the task of being the lead project officer for the first ever Fisher House dedicated to the Department of Defense outside the continental United States. Troy served as the second in command of the last Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH, unit in the Department of Defense, the 212th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and was deployed with the 212th MASH during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. He also served as the Administrative Director, Department of Surgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, before being handpicked to serve as the Army Surgeon General's Executive Assistant. Troy served in the capacity from 2007 to 2009 before becoming the Chief Operating Officer for Weed Army Community Hospital in 2009. There he led the hospital to the best Joint Commission accreditation score in the Army that year. His efforts were also instrumental in securing funds for a $300 million hospital construction project at Fort Irwin, California, the DoD's first solar-powered hospital. Upon retirement from the Army, Troy went to work for the Defense Health Agency in Falls Church, Virginia, where he presently works. Troy wrote and self-published Unwritten Truce, The Armed Services and American Social Justice in 2018 in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the desegregation of the armed forces. Now that I've said all of that, I will turn it over to Damon and Troy to get the chat started.
Well, thank you, Donna. Thank you very much. And Lieutenant Colonel Mosley, or Troy, thank you very much for joining us here and just giving us the opportunity to hear what you have to say and the things you want to share about your experience, your history, and certainly your book. And the listeners or those attending wouldn't know that we've met before. We met a couple of years ago at the 75th anniversary of the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces and the U.S. Army, and in 2023, and we realized that we had some uh, some crossover in people that we've intersected with and similar histories. So we're going to cover all that. I'm going to sort of turn it loose, and then we're going to go in a variety of different directions. But after Donna read that impressive resume of everything you've done, history of your work and your experience, again, we'll meander around, but I'll start it off this way. Um, why did you want to write this book?
Okay. That is the $10,000 question. Well, one of a couple that I hope to address. First of all, I would like to say thank you, Damon, to both you and Donna for inviting me out. This is quite a pleasure and privilege to be able to be part of the facilitation of this conversation. So, when I set out to write Unwritten Truths, it was more of my family's personal story of our journey from abject poverty into America's middle class. My father was born into a family in West Florida, a family of sharecroppers. And just to give a brief synopsis, that was the next generation, when slavery ended, those freed, enslaved persons that didn't leave the area were given the opportunity to continue to work more or less the same land, similar conditions for the same people, just getting paid, enough, to survive, and that's pretty much it. So my grandmother had an eighth grade education, and one of the things that they were fortunate in that they lived in the shadow of a historically black college and university called Florida A&M University. Back then, I think it was Florida A&M Normal College, where they taught teachers and farmers how to, grow a more productive yield. So she knew that the surest way for her children to not have their potential limited by their circumstance was through education. And although she only had an eighth grade education, she made sure that her kids that had the interest and aptitude to pursue uh, their studies did so. So, of eight brothers and sisters, my dad's one of his brothers became a dentist. He was going to go to medical school. He was accepted into medical school, but decided to go in the army. His younger brother is a pharmacist. He has an older sister that's a teacher. One has a PhD in education and so forth. And a couple joined the military out of high school. And within one generation, my dad parlayed his experience in the military. He's a Vietnam era captain into corporate success. Uh, Towards the tail end of the Vietnam War, corporate America was under pressure from the Department of Justice to enact the laws that were passed in the 1968 Civil Rights Act that prohibited discrimination in hiring practices. And I think it is necessary to highlight up until 1968, you could apply for a job at IBM, Xerox, Prince George County School Board, and if you were not a white male, they could simply tell you, we're not hiring women, we're not hiring Asians, we're not hiring blacks. And it was forced these employers to fully consider applications from other than white male Americans. And that was a pivotal moment in our nation's journey to becoming a more perfect union. We've all heard that phrase tossed around. And as I began the research and writing to tell my family story, what I quickly realized is that this is an American tale. My family was one of many families that leverage opportunities made available to them through education, through the armed services, to translate that into success, in the civilian sector. And so, a man who grew up in West Florida, without indoor plumbing, by the time he was 30 years old, was able to afford a home with a swimming pool in his backyard because of his hard work, opportunities made available to him through the military and through corporate America. And, you know, as I reflected upon my own military service, I understood, but not for the fact that we had good compulsory education and we had laws that facilitated merit-based employment that were not discriminatory or exclusionary based on race, religion, or national origin. I also probably would have been a sharecropper in West Florida. And you know, I thought this is a tale that really needs to be shared. It needs to be part of our nation's discourse. As I did more research, I found that there was very little written about the military's influence on social change. And I have chapters that speak not only to um, racial inclusion, but also that speak to women's journey through the armed services, through the armed forces. A lot of us have probably seen or heard about the movie, the 6 888 Postal Battalion. That was one example. There are many other vignettes of women Air Force service pilots who flew the bombers and fighter planes from the factories to the port of debarkation because all of the men were being trained to fly in combat. They played a pivotal role in our industrial war complex during World War II. And there's so many examples. The Native American code talkers that have contributed to the United States in all of its glory. And I speak to those traditions in my book, and not only how they impacted the military, but how they created, as you said, Damon, outward pressure for American society in general to embrace and reconsider who was worthy of contributing.
That's great. That's great. And thank you for give us that context that you really want to honor your family, particularly honor your father's journey and just the way your family held together and definitely gave you and your sister, I believe it is. You have a
Yes.
right, just a different
Yes.
life. Yes.
Right.
And so maybe you can explain to us what an unwritten truce is, like how you, what does that mean to you, and what should we understand what an unwritten truce
Right.
is?
Right. So I think therein lies part of the richness of this conversation. And, I'm going to preface what I'm going to say by saying the views that I'm expressing today are those of my own and not of any of the, many institutions that I'm affiliated with. But in essence, America's journey to become a more perfect union has always been fraught with uh, discord between who are the rightful recipients of the fruits of democracy. Some people will maintain that America was a country founded by white men, and it is none of our founding documents expressly say that. And I would submit to you, there were abolitionists, there were people who were founding members of our documents, framers, that did not believe in slavery. And because these men were intelligent men, I believe they wrote exactly what they said. Although they may have been living in conflict, I believe they had hope that the future heirs of democracy would find their way to living an expression that was written, that all men are created equal. If they were to put qualifiers on that statement, it would have made the statement itself an oxymoron, right? All men are created equal except black men, except natives. It would have made them no better than the tyrants in Europe that they were fleeing. And it would have robbed this fledgling republic of the elegance and the legitimacy of being a truly colorblind society where someone's mere existence, membership in the human condition made them entitled to freedom and liberties. So I submit that that argument has never been settled from the beginning. Had they wanted to be exclusive, they would not have made it a malleable document. That's the second thing that I would say for anyone who says, well, obviously it was, written and therefore intended for white men because the people who framed it were, and some of them owned slaves, but all of them didn't. The third point that I would make is that when the Constitution was written, they outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. And they did so, in my opinion, because they knew it was amoral and unethical. And that was the compromise to say that we will continue to have the institution of slavery, but the people who did not support that or believe in that insisted that the practice of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. What's that, about 26 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. So there are many um, points of evidence that we can point to say the conversation around who was America intended for has not been settled. And then, of course, we have the Civil War and what many historians call the second founding of America, which enshrined into the Constitution citizenship for the formerly enslaved and their descendants. The right to vote was also enshrined. And from there, we point to this is the progress that America has made. I make the argument in my book that the role that Black Americans played in securing our liberty in the Revolutionary War. Many historians say the first person killed in that conflict was a man of African and Native heritage, Crispus Attucks. And there were a number of Black men that fought for both the British and the Americas to win freedom. Um, so the evidence of that patriotism, that military service carries on into the Civil War. Some 180,000 Black Americans fought for their own liberation. And the military recognizes the pragmatic need for manpower and also the reality that you cannot subordinate or subjugate someone at the same time you're asking them to give their lives for a cause. So these two realities uh, forced a sense of pragmatism that the armed services were generally uh, more accepting of non-traditional norms around racial restrictions than America at large. President Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948. That was 6 years before what we recognize as the watershed moment in integration in America, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. So I make the argument that the military was always trying to balance these two oppositional worldviews to maintain a societal world order that did not recognize people of color as equals, but also the need to uh, man, train, equip, and field an army capable of winning its nation's wars. So a little bit in front of times, but not too far ahead. And that's kind of the unwritten truths that the military kind of abided by until I would argue present day. And if we are to take anything from the news and the firing of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, and the firing of the Navy's first woman chief of naval operations, this oppositional worldview tug of war is still being played out.
Yeah, wonderful. Actually, you you segue right into kind of what I was thinking about. I was going to ask you, what are you thinking today about compared to just 2 years ago about the unwritten truths? I wanted to sort of get your, and then of course have you comment on the General Brown and Admiral Franchetti, and their experience and what you know about their experience. And if you have anything else to add, then that's wonderful. I can also, in your book, you mentioned, I kind of want to get into your personal recognition of when you had, I guess, an awakening. You mentioned an awakening when you were a kid, I don't know, 7 or 8, and you were in the Atlanta airport.
Right.
Is that right? And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and how that impacts, the way you look at the way you saw race moving forward in your father's life and his experience in your family's life.
Great questions. I guess I'm going to start with the latter question first. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my mother's presence on the Zoom, Miss Terry Mosley. She's a school teacher by training of over 40 years in the Duval County public school system and many other talents that I won't go into right now. But essentially, what happened was my dad, when he left the Army, and I think about 72, he was recruited by the Bell South Baby Bell Company into their management training program. And as a function of that, we were moving from Jacksonville, Florida to Atlanta, and we were house hunting. And it was the first time I had ever ridden on a plane. I was in an airport, your typical rambunctious 7, 8-year-old boy, just around the gift shop, toy hobby horse, pretending to ride, and toy pistol, holster. And I came upon these two hats. One was the American Civil War era, patrol hat with the U.S. flag, and the other one was a Confederate patrol cap with the stars and bars Confederate flag on it. Well, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Let me check this out. And I, put it on my head, and was kind of going through the gift shop, and my mom grabs the hat, takes it off my head, takes the hobby horse. Absolutely not. Gave me a book, sit down. And that's really all she said at the time. But her actions were so deliberate and decisive that I knew I had, done something that broke some protocol, right? I knew I had done something wrong. So when we got back to Florida, I asked my mom, I said, "Hey, mom, when we were in the airport, why did you take that hat from me?" And she was like, "Baby, that hat was worn by men who fought to keep our ancestors enslaved." And at that time, I never knew anything about the Civil War or the tradition of Black Americans being brought to America uh, in chains. My only reference to slavery was the old Charlton Heston movie, the Ten Commandments, let my people go, that played every Easter. And she didn't have to say anything else, Damon. I had a sharp and distinct sense of shame. I'm like, oh my God, here I am running around the airport with, the symbol of my oppressors on my head. And I just felt the weight of, hundreds of years of oppression and inhumanity and a loss of dignity just, rush upon my personage. And that started my fascination with America's journey to become a more perfect union through the civil rights movement, through the Civil War.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mentioned that. Thank you. And uh, as you recall, I also grew up a good part of my life in Florida. And around the third grade, I kind of got the same kind of awakening, if you will. Not, and I think some of it coincided with Alex Haley's miniseries, Roots, and all that, right? That
Right.
was, but it speaks to kind of how America, and particularly Black folks, were educated or miseducated or not educated on the subject, largely, broadly. Um, which would lead into something else, like the cultivation of how we are as we grow. And that leads me to the question of, you mentioned when you were in the military, right around 1995, you had this little study, quote unquote, that you did.
Right.
And I'd be interested for you to share what that study was and just what you learned broadly about
Yeah, sure.
that.
Before I address that, I'm very quickly just going to add on to what you said about that awakening moment. I would submit any person of color um, comes to a point where we are taught to believe in merit and color blindness and everything, where we buy into that lock, stock, and barrel. But there comes a time where I would submit every person who is any type of a minority, probably women also, experience a moment where you are confronted with the reality that everybody else doesn't view you the same way. And it has a lot to do with the color of your skin or your gender or some other difference that you have no control over. Um, there's that. My youngest daughter came home from nursery from daycare one day when she was about 4 years old from the military daycare, and she said to me, "Daddy, why am I not white? How come we're not white? I want to be white." And I would submit to you that was her awakening moment. Something happened in her life that made her realize she was not being treated the same way, or, I'm projecting, of course, onto her experience, but that certainly was a conversation that we had. Fast forward to 1995, I was in a career milestone professional school within the military called the Officer Advanced Course. Officers will go between their fourth and seventh year of service. It's to teach you how to be a middle manager, more or less from entry level as a lieutenant. And at that time, the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, and we would have occasion before seminars start to kind of, listen to CNN and see what was going on around the world. And of course, we were gripped like the rest of America with this, O.J. Simpson trial. Was he guilty? Was he not guilty? And I will surmise my experience this way. Most of the black officers, I would say 90+%, felt that O.J. Simpson probably was guilty, but that the prosecution was guilty of malfeasance, planning evidence, perjuring themselves to the point where you couldn't say without a shadow of a doubt whether he was guilty or not. Whereas my white officer contemporaries all felt without question he's guilty, he's absolutely guilty, and they were willing to discount or overlook the perjured testimony by Mark Harmon, the mishandling of the case, and the other missteps. And that was, to me, another piece of evidence of how we view our realities through different lenses based on our different experiences.
And you said, what percentage did you say you thought the white contingent of your very informal study?
I would say probably about 85 to 90% felt he was guilty, and conversely, 90 to 95% of Black Americans felt that he wasn't guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Right. And in this, among this group of people who you were performing this little study, did they share their opinions amongst one another? And did that create any kind of tension, or did people get enough tension and they walk away from it, or what was the dynamic there?
Yeah. You know, by all other measures, besides, gender or race, you have a very homogeneous group of people. Uh, College educated ROTC grads, West Point grads, young families, healthcare professionals. And for our opinions to be so sharply divided, it was, in my opinion, purely based on our lived experiences in the skin that we came to the course in. Um, there were, some good-natured ribbing, sometimes it got a little tense, but by the most part, we were able to subordinate however we felt about that case to do our group assignments, to do our group work. And, by and large, that's been my experience within the military. Um, we, when I say we, I mean people of the military pride themselves in being apolitical to the extent possible. But I would submit in this day and age where our politics have become so vitriolic, where someone's mere existence is a political point, where we've had the Secretary of Defense state his beliefs that senior general officers that are African American or women are quote unquote DEI hires. Um, there but for their racial affiliation or their sex. It's kind of hard to split the difference on somebody who doesn't recognize your intelligence and your ability. That's taking it to the extreme.
Right. Right. Well, you're just segging right into the next thing, because also in your book and part of this unwritten truce, one of the big points is the appointment or the career progression of officers and military personnel. And so you mentioned there was a RAND study, minority and gender, career progression, and I believe the dates were like 67 to 91, 1967, 1991. And then you do around 2010, 2011 go into other series of progression. So my question really is, do you have a sense of what's happening lately when it comes to career progression of minorities and women and et cetera, in the Army or across the military in general?
Hmm. Hmm. I will start by saying if you are a non-ethnic minority, um, our society's public opinion on race will ebb and flow. Just as recently as 2023, General C.Q. Brown was nominated to receive his fourth star by the same Donald Trump who is our president today. And within the span of 4 years, he has gone from someone who was seen as worthy of the highest rank to someone who is an anathema to this, similar administration. Same executive, but many of the surrounding members are different. And I would also submit to everyone that it is telling that the people that came in with President Trump, the General Kellys of the world, the General Mattises of the world, will no longer affiliate and associate themselves with him, that he would have to find someone who is patently unqualified because of their loyalty, because the men who he had, although we could disagree on policy or politics, we all took an oath to the Constitution and we were all loyal to that. And that was part of what binded us, where we could say we're apolitical, but we all believe in representative democracy. I think that um, our present day government has gone astray off of the track of representative democracy. I'm not sure what form of government you would call it, but it's not the representative democracy that we were taught. And yeah, I'm sorry, but as far as promotion
Mm-hmm.
rates, the promotion rates have been more or less the same since the late 70s. And that's why the military has embarked on a deliberate educational platform to teach people to appreciate that we all come from different walks of life, urban areas, farms, suburbs, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and we have to take this pluralistic, multi-ethnic group of people and shape them into a cohesive force. And one of the best ways to do that is to teach people about diversity and equity, that we do have cultural traditions and that they all are of value, and that when we come together, we can achieve synergy that is greater than the individual parts. But if you don't believe that, if you think that, and I think someone in this cabinet even came out and just said, if you want things to work properly, you need to put a white man in charge, quote unquote.
Wow, that's that's powerful, right? I remember at the celebration a couple of years ago, 75th anniversary celebration, and I want you to answer it again for those who will be listening to this program. And it's basically, in your military career, how well educated were you concerning Black officers and those who came before you? Did the military offer that kind of information to you readily?
You know, it was not a robust education in the contributions of minorities. I would say, looking back on my own experience, I knew General Chappie James was like the first four-star general in any of the armed forces. Um, of course, Colin Powell. Um, I knew of the first West Point cadet that was appointed, Lieutenant Flipper and his Anderson was the first Black American admitted to West Point. But other than that, it was pretty scant. My experiences in Europe, I learned more about the contribution of, the ordinary average American soldier than I did in any of my formal training. There are monuments erected to all Black units that fought during World War One. The 369th Infantry Regiment from Harlem fought wearing French uniforms before the United States even got into the war, and they received numerous French citations, the equivalent of the French Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre. I think they had like seven recipients from that unit. There's an obelisk erected in the town of Seychelles, France, that they saved from being overrun by the Germans during World War One. And my commander, General Granger, organized a what they call a staff ride. It's kind of like a field trip where you give the historical setting of the conflict and what happened. And afterwards, we had a nice brunch that the village sponsored, and we laid some wreaths at the headstones of some of the members that were killed during that battle. So I learned all of those things while I was assigned in Europe and not through formal training. And that was also part of my compulsion to include them in the book.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we have, I believe, so we're going to have questions in a little bit, maybe 7 to 12 minutes. So I want to get as much as we can in before that, because
That's my favorite part. I like the questions.
Yeah, okay. So we'll just go with the flow, and then when Donna chimes in to read the questions, we can do that. But I wanted to ask you about so the GI Bill comes in around 1944 originally, is that right?
Right.
And of course, there was some time before African American soldiers and veterans could really take full advantage of it. Your father was in the military, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So your father did he receive full benefit of the GI Bill? And if so, how did that impact?
Well, I'm going to put my mom on the spot and see if she wants to take a stab at that.
Hello, Ms. Mosley. Mosley, it's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for sure.
Great notice, Troy. Well, I met Josh Mosley at Florida A&M, and he was enrolled in the ROTC. And he was planning to go to the military after graduation as an officer. And through that ROTC program, he was able to pretty much pay for his college education. Of course, he had to work some side jobs. He had, like they say, side hustles when he off during the summer. And he was very diligent in that. And so he always had this expression of being an officer and a gentleman. So that was his career path, going through the military with a major in biology, with future plans of becoming a medical doctor. And then that was what he encouraged Troy to do as well. And
Yeah.
that's it.
I think I would add on, Mom, correct me if I'm wrong. When we bought our first home, when you and Dad bought the first home when Rebought Scenic Drive, that he used his GI Bill as did did he? No. Okay. Okay. I misspoke. So
Okay.
that's it.
No, that's very interesting.
As I recall, I could be wrong. Yeah,
But
but
that's okay. That's wonderful. Because that would be interesting. Maybe Troy, we probably need like 3 hours to have this conversation, but so we can do this again at another, another time. I also wanted to ask you, since you brought it up a little earlier, so about the current trend, what do you think can be done, if anything, to successfully reverse this current reality of the governmental? I don't even want to call it a process. I don't know what you call it, but the reality we're seeing now.
Right.
What do you think can be done from a military standpoint, if you will, just in terms of appointments here, appointments there, these types of things?
Yeah. Military perspective, don't expect or look for members of the armed service to be vocal in opposing these changes. The military is supposed to be an apolitical institution that is unified behind the oath we take to the Constitution. I would say that the dichotomy of this administration is that their allegiance seems to be an oath to the commander in chief, two very distinct things, because part of that oath is to support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that is the glue that binds members. That's the allegiance that we swear. And interestingly enough, that oath was brought into favor following the Civil War, um, as a means of reconciling and bringing the nation back together. There were loyalists to the Confederacy that they made everyone take an oath so that they would have some assurance that there were not duplicitous or dual loyalties. Um, One could even make the case that uh, because there was no truce to end the Civil War, a lot of the beliefs that started the war, a belief in racial supremacy, kind of went underground and formed a what would you call it? A an opposition, a subversive
Yeah.
feeling that the South will rise again was more than a slogan, and the same people who actually fought for the Confederacy, their defendants fought to preserve segregation. They fought against the Civil Rights Acts, etc. And now, in this current president, I believe they have found someone that they share an unspecified belief in racial supremacy, and that's why they are so strong on allegiance to a person and not to the Constitution. And that's just my opinion.
Well said. Well said. Um, right now we have about 15 minutes. Donna, are we okay for questions?
I was going to say, at the moment, we have no questions. So if you want to keep talking.
Oh, I've got nothing but questions. So, well, for me, so this is really interesting. So, do you have any enlightenment on how, so Truman signs Executive Order 9981 in 48. During the Korean action, there is some there's a little bit more deployment of African American, Black American infantrymen or soldiers. Um, can you give us a little bit of information on that background there?
Sure. So in Korea, that was the first armed conflict in which the United States fought as an integrated force. In 1948, Truman signed the executive order, and I have an interesting anecdote about the executive order, if you remind me, if we
Okay,
don't come back
I'll
to
do
it.
that.
But
Yeah.
uh, General Ridgway was the one that insisted upon ending segregation, even though that the order was passed in 48. You had some of the people who wanted to subvert the intent of the policy that resisted fully implementing it. And it was under the uh, intense demands of combat that General Ridgway finally said, this is impractical, for me to not be able to fully staff a combat ready unit because a white radio telephone operator. He's like, well, I have 5 black ones here. Why can't I just plug them in? The executive order says I can do so. But he had leaders that were above him that were trying to circumvent implementation of 9981. In fact, the very first ever Secretary of the Army, that is the civilian lead of the Army, each service has a political appointee at the head of the service, was relieved. He was fired for refusing to implement Executive Order 9981. But yeah, Korea was the first time we fought as an integrated force, and it was under the pressure of combat and the vision and the leadership of General Ridgway that said, we need to make this happen yesterday, and it did.
Hey, if we have a moment, you did say you had an anecdote. I can do that, or I can move on to something.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Executive Order 9981 didn't just roll off of Truman's desk. One of the first ever presidential task force was convened. President Truman appointed captains of industry. Uh, I think the CEO of Westinghouse, one of the automobile manufacturers, uh, the first African American woman to receive a PhD in economics from University of Pennsylvania, I believe, was a part of the committee, and they came back with 10 recommendations. His charter to them was how to make equal protection for America's minority citizens. Following World War II, there were violent clashes surrounding race. A lot of the people in the South were determined to insist nothing would change as a result of Black Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans service in World War II. So there were violent racial clashes. And this was the second time it had happened. It happened after World War I, of which Truman was a captain in the field artillery, and he witnessed this as an officer. And he said that I will not allow this to happen again. So he convened this task force. They came up with 10 recommendations how to make the charter of equal protection under the law a reality, one of which was desegregating the armed forces. The other was some of the others were establishment of the Department of Justice, a civil rights division within the Department of Justice, and all of the recommendations except one were implemented. The one that was not implemented was a federal. So that's the vignette.
How very interesting, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned the establishing a civil rights division in the Department of Justice. That would be considered today, I suppose, as DEI, right?
Well, that would be an offshoot or one of the programs that the Civil Rights Division of DOJ would manage. But we have had a Civil Rights Division as a part of DOJ since like 48. They look at would be like equal sentencing, for convicted felons, um, equal funding for schools. One of the incidents that caused President Truman to reflect upon equal protection under the law was the blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodward. Sergeant Woodward was returning from World War II. He was exiting off of active duty. He was on a bus from Charleston, South Carolina, back to New York. He asked the bus driver if he could use the bathroom. The bus driver said, no, get your ass to the back of the bus. Pardon my French, but that's kind of the gestalt of the conflict between the two. The bus driver didn't like, Sergeant Woodward standing up for himself and advocating in the way that he did. So they pulled over to a town that was known to have a racially abusive and violent sheriff. And the bus driver reported Sergeant Woodward to the sheriff, and the sheriff drug the young sergeant off the bus. He was, not a big man, kind of wiry guy, and he brutalized him and gouged his eyes out in the jail cell. When Truman learned of this, he was furious. He sent the FBI director to investigate. And in those days, it was unheard of for a white man to stand trial for assaulting or even killing a black man, let alone a police officer. Um, the police officer was brought to trial, and in like 15 minutes, he was acquitted by a local town's jury. But that compelled Truman to study the question of equal protection under the law. Um, President Truman, I think, was a fair and honest man. He was not by any means a uh, a liberal person. He was known to use the N word and the pejorative, um, but he did believe that America could do better by its black and brown citizens. And he also knew that if we were to shop democracy around the world as the favored system of governance, the way that we treated minorities in this country was the Achilles heel of democracy, and he wanted to change that.
So we do have a question. So Lynn Roberts asks, do you think that the fact that not only the president, but large numbers of government leaders have avoided or never served in our military has influenced the current attitude of so-called leaders?
That is a great question. And I would say yes. I think there has been some impact by the lack of military service in how our leaders view the military and how the policies are being administered. I mean, we're all familiar with the saying, when you know better, you do better. And what DEI is about is educating people on how we are different and how our differences don't necessarily have to impact our aptitude or our ability. If I'm a pilot, for example, and I am chauvinistic and I don't see women as my peers, then it would be impossible for me to mentor women pilots because my worldview or my position on gender equity would be an absolute barrier to me encouraging, promoting, mentoring a woman pilot. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, I would submit. And so, what DEI does is it makes us aware of our vulnerabilities that we all bring to the table. And it teaches us the first thing that we need to do is to ask ourselves a difficult question. Is my attitude toward this person based on some type of personal prejudice that I bring? And the simple fact of asking that question will mitigate almost everyone's ability to act negatively towards a person that's different from them.
Thank you. I have another question. Unless you have another question?
No, not at the moment.
Great. So this is going to seem off in a little bit different direction, but I'm curious about this. What does an Army Surgeon General Executive Assistant do? Like, you have a lot of responsibility, right?
It's a lot of responsibility. It's mainly you make sure nothing falls through the crack. So I have to know what my boss's itinerary is, every meeting that he has on the calendar to make sure that the person responsible for getting him to the meetings knows how to get there, knows to be there 15 minutes early. The subject matter experts that are responsible for preparing the Surgeon General for the meeting, if we're talking about hospital construction bill that's going before the House Arms Subcommittee for funding, that they give him all the pertinent details, at least 24 hours in advance so he's prepared for the meeting. And being prepared to juggle the schedule if something comes up and he can't attend the meeting, to have somebody that is read in or versed on the subject to be able to be flexed into that space. Sometimes it's speech writing. Sometimes it's setting up a phone call with another subordinate leader, putting together a list of candidates to replace yourself or somebody else that works with the Surgeon General. So it's just a myriad of tasks that require, you to be, metaphorically speaking, a step ahead so that he can be present in the moment.
Well, thank you for that. And one other question, going back a little bit back in your career, you were in Iraqi Freedom. You participated. You were in a MASH unit. Is that right?
Right, right.
How difficult was that?
It was very difficult. For the first 72 hours of the ground war, this was when Saddam Hussein was still in power, and we went into Iraq to depose him. Our forces were fighting against the, Iraqi Imperial Guard, their active duty military, and they pretty much dismantled the Iraqi military in short order. But there was a lot of collateral damage, civilians that were injured in the melee. So most of the casualties were uh, Iraqi soldiers, as by the Geneva Convention, we treat everyone, not just our own, and and some civilians that were caught in collateral damage. And one of the reasons I didn't follow my father's um, aspirations of becoming a doctor is because I was squeamish. And so I'm like, I'll be an administrator,
Mm.
and you saw your fair share of significant trauma. But the other thing that I will say about the MASH is you see how a team can come together, men and women. A MASH is 100% mobile. It takes 32 5-ton trucks to move an 8-bed surgical hospital with all of its accoutrements, um, anesthesia machines, autoclaves that sterilize the instruments, generators to power the operating beds and the x-rays and all of that. And so, with a unit of about 150 people, we have a lot of skilled nurses that had to get their 5-ton license because I can only drive, my truck drivers, 5 or 6 hours before they have to get a break. And sometimes you have 12, 14-hour movements, and you got to get your young, eager, talented BSN nursing lieutenant a 5-ton license so that you all can move to where you're supposed to be and be set up in time to receive casualties. And these women fought bravely. They improvised. They did what they had to do in order to make it happen. And the men um, understood, hey, this big steering wheel that doesn't have power steering, that's hard for my little 5'1" nurse to handle. I'm going to drive this one and let her drive the other one that has, power steering. It's that type of teamwork. Instead of saying she can't do it, it's let's figure out how we can do it. And then when we get in the hospital and this young guy needs to start an IV and he's not good at that or trained at that, this nurse who's very good at starting IVs will come over and say, here's how you do it. and you have to have the buy-in of everybody in order to make it work. If you start from the position of, women shouldn't be here, Asians, whatever shouldn't be here, of course it's not going to work.
So we do have one more question, and this will be the last question for the evening. This is from Terry Mosley. How has the military elevated the lives of Americans and minorities?
I think there are numerous ways. One way is that it provides an example of how we can be as citizens if we come together, if we look past our differences, if we have compassion in our hearts. It sets an example for, true patriotism. The belief that we all deserve to be seen and heard, and we all have something to contribute. And I think that's why the military is one of the institutions that everybody looks up to. The last thing I wanted to say before we depart, what can citizens do right now? Call your congressman, email your congressman, and let them know how you feel about DEI being removed from the curriculum, from our institutions.
Okay, thank you. So I want to thank Troy and your mom for participating tonight, and thank you, Damon, for doing the hosting duties. Our next chat will be on March 24th, 2025. So look for your invitation coming probably about a week before that. So if nobody has any other further questions, I'm going to stop the recording. Stacy Hawkins did comment, thank you so much for a great presentation.
And I just want to say thank you, Troy. Thank you, Mrs. Mosley. I hope this is the first mother-son tag team that we've had, but I'm not sure if it is. But
yeah, you got
it is.
That's
great.
It's our first as well.
Great. Well, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Talking soon. Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.